Friends, the world is changing before our eyes. What seemed unthinkable until recently is now becoming a reality. Western sanctions, attempts to isolate Russia, and economic pressure have all had unexpected consequences. Who really won in this confrontation, and who found themselves in a deep crisis? Today we will figure this out together and hear the hard truth from Sachs right in the European Parliament. Don't switch. It will be interesting. According to the expert, Europe has already made a serious mistake by severing long-term relations with Russia, which have been built over the centuries. Instead of seeking compromises and strengthening diplomatic ties, European countries continue to pursue the path of increasing confrontation, while the United States, according to Sachs, pursues exclusively its own interests, which has led Europe to a severe energy and economic crisis. He also stressed that the current conflict in Eastern Europe, in his opinion, was artificially provoked and could have been prevented. Before turning to the highlights of the speech, I want to say a few words about how the situation has developed in recent decades. For a quarter of a century, Western countries have consistently underestimated Russia's role in international politics. It would seem that certain lessons should have been learned over this long period, but the habit of viewing Moscow through the prism of one's own expectations turned out to be too strong. At one time, Vladimir Putin proposed building a joint security system in Europe and also allowed for the possibility of cooperation with NATO. However, Washington and Brussels reacted to these initiatives without enthusiasm, making it clear that Russia has no place in the framework of European security. At the time, it seemed that the West was doing quite well on its own, but subsequent decades have shown that this approach has not justified itself. Today, Europe has to face the consequences of these decisions. In 2008, Dmitry Medvedev also made a proposal to conclude an agreement on a comprehensive security system in Europe. However, the reaction of Western countries was predictable. They refused to take on additional obligations. Instead, the gradual erosion of the system of strategic stability that was built after the end of the Cold War continued. As a result, Europe has found itself in a state of constant instability. At the same time, Moscow is often solely responsible for what is happening. The moment when Russia declared that it was ready to act was especially significant. Vladimir Putin's statements that specific measures would be taken in response to the supply of long-range missiles have surprised Western politicians. However, actions followed immediately. It seems that every time Western countries try to put pressure on Moscow, the situation develops according to an unpredictable scenario for them. A striking example was the sanctions, which were supposed to cause serious damage to the Russian economy. However, in the end, this led to completely different consequences. The European economy itself faced record inflation, an energy crisis, and a decline in competitiveness. Western analysts are not ignoring what is happening. Sachs has repeatedly noted that the United States is step by step weakening Europe's security by destroying international agreements. Now that Russia is responding to these actions, Western capitals are expressing bewilderment. According to the expert, Vladimir Putin has been warning about possible consequences for years, but these signals were not taken seriously. Now, European countries have to deal with a reality they preferred to ignore. James Rickards, a former CIA advisor, also believes that the strategic thinking of Western politicians has hardly changed since the Cold War, and this, in his opinion, is one of the main mistakes. The only question is how seriously those who make key decisions are prepared for this very reality. Meanwhile, Russia is not just reacting, it is setting new rules of the game. The use of the Orshnik hypersonic ballistic missile was not just another signal of a demonstration of capabilities that until recently were considered fantastic. In an instant, the strategic facilities on which the West had placed large bets simply disappeared. The Western media interpret this situation differently, claiming that Putin is only brandishing his nuclear cudgel. However, if earlier in Europe they seriously hoped that all this was a bluff, now the situation has changed dramatically. A logical question arises: how much more evidence is needed for Brussels to finally understand that Russia is not joking? Perhaps it's time to start thinking that if the strategy doesn't work every time, then maybe it's worth rethinking the approach itself? What for? After all, it is much more interesting to continue making the same mistakes over and over again and be genuinely surprised when Russia gives an adequate response. As they say, unfortunately, history repeats itself. And now, friends, as I promised, let's hear what Jeffrey Sachs says in the European Parliament and how he demolishes all the arguments of Ursula von der Leyen. And before we continue, I would like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and like this video, because it is very important to promote our channel. Also write a comment about which city you are watching this video from. Important conclusions will be drawn at the very end of this video, so keep watching so you don't miss anything. And now a quote from Jeffrey Sachs. At the end of 2021, Putin made a last attempt to negotiate security by proposing two draft agreements, one to Europe and the other to the United States. On December 15th of the same year, the United States received these proposals. That same day, I had an hour-long conversation with Jake Sullivan at the White House, where I literally begged him, "Jake, don't let this conflict happen. It can be avoided. All you have to do is just declare that NATO will not expand into the territory of the country that is currently in conflict with Russia." He replied to me, "NATO is not going to expand there. Don't worry." I said, "Jake, say it publicly." He replied, No, we can't say that publicly." I tell him, "You're causing conflict because of this." He replied, "Don't worry, there won't be a conflict. I'll tell you this, these people aren't very smart, to be honest. They are not particularly perceptive at all. I've been dealing with them for over 4 years now, and they're just talking to themselves, not others. They're playing their own game theory. If you're familiar with game theory, you'll understand what I'm talking about. This is a strategy that originated at the Rand Corporation and is still actively used by the American leadership. In 2019, Rand even released a special document called How to Weaken Russia. Do you know what they wrote there? How to annoy Russia, how to provoke it, how to make it fall apart, how to create a crisis in Russia. Perhaps even regime change, internal instability, and economic chaos. So, this is who you call your ally? Are you kidding me? What happened next? The very next month, they completely abandoned the negotiations. NATO and the so-called open door policy. Are you serious? NATO reserves the right to expand anywhere, completely disregarding the opinion of its neighbors. So, I would advise Mexicans and Canadians not to test this on themselves. Imagine if Canada suddenly told China, "Why don't you build a military base in Ontario?" What would Washington's reaction be? I'd bet they'd say, "They can do whatever they want. It's none of our business." No, they would have reacted completely differently. In Europe, they continue to repeat these mantras. Representatives of the European Commission, your High Representative, they all carry this nonsense. This is not even the level of childish geopolitics. It's just a complete lack of thinking. So, the conflict has begun. What was Putin's goal? I can tell you which one. He wanted to force the president of a famous country to sit down at the negotiating table. 7 days after the start of the operation, you should understand this, and not believe the propaganda that says that Putin failed, that he was going to take over a neighboring country. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at things soberly. All that was required was to keep NATO out. And what is NATO? This is the United States. The only question was to prevent them from entering the Russian border. Nothing more. I have to add one more important point. First, if China or Russia decided to place a military base on the border with the United States, whether on the Rio Grande or on the Canadian border, the United States would not just worry, the conflict would begin within 10 minutes. But there is another reason. The United States unilaterally withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, thereby destroying the entire nuclear control system. It is extremely important to understand this. The nuclear weapons control system was based on the prevention of a first strike, and the relevant treaty was a key element of this mechanism. When the United States withdrew from it in 2002, it was a real shock to Russia. Everything I am talking about is happening in the context of the destruction of the nuclear deterrent system. And starting in 2011, the United States began deploying military systems in Poland, and then in Romania. Of course, Russia didn't like it. One of the key issues discussed in December 2021 and January 2022 was the U.S. declaration of its right to deploy missile systems on the territory of a well-known country. And then what did Blinken say to Lavrov in January 2022? He stated bluntly, "The United States reserves the right to deploy missile systems wherever it sees fit." Here's your ally. Now let's recall the situation with medium-range missiles in Germany. The United States unilaterally withdrew from the Treaty on the Elimination of Intermediate-Range and Shorter-Range Missiles in 2019. Today, we do not have any nuclear weapons control system at all. Zero. When the president of a famous country said 7 days after the start of the operation, "Let's negotiate," I knew absolutely all the details about it. Within a few weeks, a document was agreed upon which Putin approved. Lavrov handed it over, and Turkish mediators helped organize the negotiation process. I personally flew to Ankara to learn more about it. A well-known country was ready to sign the agreement, but at the last moment she refused. And do you know why? That's right, because of the UK. And now, to summarize today, this project failed initially. The idea was that Russia would surrender. They thought that Russia would not be able to resist. The Americans were sure that they had all the trumps in their hands, that they would win because they could bluff. They expected that Russia would not fight seriously, would not mobilize reserves. They believed that by disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, they could destroy it, and sanctions would crush its economy. I've been listening to this nonsense for 70 years now, consciously about 56 years old. They talk this nonsense every day. I know their rhetoric by heart. As a representative of a well-known country, I dealt with them and advised them. I told them, be neutral. Don't listen to the Americans. I repeated to them the famous phrase of Henry Kissinger. It is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but it is deadly to be their friend. I repeat once again, being an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but being their friend is deadly. Friends, how do you like Sachs' statement in the European Parliament? I consider him to be one of the most pragmatic and objective experts in the world. But here's the question. Will anyone hear him? I'm sure it doesn't. Because if no one listened to him before, why would anyone hear him now, especially in the European Parliament? Since Europe decided to put everything on the line by entering into a tough confrontation with Russia, dozens of sanctions packages have been adopted, loud statements have been made, and economic restrictions have been imposed. All this is in order to break the Russian economy and isolate Moscow in the international arena. But the bad luck is that today it is Europe that is facing the consequences of its own decisions. And Russia, contrary to all forecasts, has not only survived, but also strengthened its position. The collapse of the Russian economy never took place. When Western analysts predicted its collapse, they clearly did not take into account several important factors. In 3 years, the Russian economy has shown growth, and the unemployment rate remains at record lows. This became possible due to the reorientation of trade to the east and the development of its own industry. And what about Europe? The picture here is much less rosy. Over the past 3 years, the European Union has faced a number of serious problems. Record inflation, the energy crisis, and massive business closures. In my humble opinion, this was the result of the complete abandonment of Russian gas, oil, and coal. Previously, Europe received stable and affordable energy resources, but now it is forced to purchase liquefied natural gas from the United States at inflated prices, which, of course, negatively affects the standard of living of ordinary citizens. Factories are closing, and enterprises are moving their production to other regions of the world where business conditions are more favorable. Companies from Germany, Italy, France, and even the United States now carefully analyze the possible ways of returning to Russia, knowing that the Russian market is not only collapsed, but has become more attractive due to the growth of domestic production and consumption. However, now the rules of the game have changed. You can return, but only on the terms of Moscow, not Brussels or Washington. Friends, now I would like to express my opinion. This material made me think about a lot of things. It clearly shows criticism of Western policy and its consequences, especially in relation to Russia. Jeffrey Sachs, as always, is straightforward and does not hesitate to express his opinion about how American and European leaders are not just making mistakes, but actually leading the world to instability. He very accurately noted that due to ignoring the opinions and interests of Russia, the West itself found itself in an economic trap. I especially liked how he focuses on the fact that Western sanctions not only did not break Russia, but also became a powerful blow to the West itself. The West was faced with an energy crisis, rising prices, and the closure of enterprises, while Russia, despite all expectations, was able not only to withstand, but also to significantly strengthen its position. As a result, the outcome of this battle is obvious. The West has not been able to destroy the Russian economy, but on the contrary, it has found itself in a much worse position. This is a lesson worth learning. If you continue to follow the path of misunderstanding and ignoring others, you may end up on the sidelines. And now it's your turn to express your opinion. Friends, be sure to write your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for supporting my channel, liking and subscribing. This is very important to me. See you in the new videos.